Justine, with NAPLAN, I actually think, I agree with you about your diagnosis, but I think the problem is even worse because the minimum standard is set so low. So it's not just the 10% falling below the minimum. The minimum is a joke. You need 3 out of 25, you'd say year 3 out of 25 questions for spelling, and I think it was 8 out of 37 for reading, and they're multiple choice. So 90% of kids would be able to get that result just purely by random answers. So really, if we set the point, and I think, Jennifer, you were using that category of minimum or below, we're actually talking about probably more like 20% of kids that are really failing, and possibly, if you look at some of that international stuff, 40%. In terms of accountability, one of the areas that I find curious is the lack of action on the part of Vice-Chancellors. How often do we get Vice-Chancellors pontificating about the standard of students that are coming into their universities, and yet they are presiding over these education faculties who are absolutely, as all three of you said, who really are the fundamental cause of this problem?
Yeah. I'm going to ask Stephen Schwartz to say something later, but in the meantime, perhaps let whoever wants to answer that.
I was going to jump in first there and say I think partly that is education is relatively cheap to provide as a degree compared to some other ones. So there's a perverse incentive on universities, particularly with the remove on capped places, to enrol more and more education students, and you've seen ATARs go down into the 40s in some institutions. So,
anyone else want to comment on that, on those comments? Yep.
2 points. One is that it does vary substantially between universities. Some universities have extremely low entry standards, and some have extremely high, and they actually take on great students, and then they do great things with them once they have them. But I guess it's the sort of most direct point of reference, but it's actually a cycle, a cultural cycle. There is very little external reference point now with regard to an academic depth and in particular an empirical depth. When researchers such as Ken Reid produce empirically based research about what works, they become folk heroes amongst teachers. People are so desperate for that sort of evidence. The whole focus on case studies and so on that has very limited policy applicability, we're drowning in. But the lack of creates the further lack of. I guess it becomes a bit cyclical.
Jen, anything there? Just Stephen Schwartz, do you want to say anything? We'll give you a microphone. Stephen Schwartz. Okay, Stephen's going to speak at the end, so I'll leave it till then. There's plenty over the back there then, yes.
Just leading on from that last question, I would like to put to the panel the proposition that perhaps we should take teacher education out of the universities, given that we have to wait for all of the constructivists to die off. So really, do we have that much time? I think perhaps we should consider whether we did, as in the past, had teacher education preparation institutions that actually turned out teachers who could teach reading. Yeah. The people who could teach reading are now retiring because they're getting old, and they were the people who were taught in a 2-year course, how to teach reading. What does the panel think about taking teacher preparation out of universities altogether? Jen?
Well, since it was Robin that proposed it, of course, I think it's a wonderful idea. But really, I haven't thought about that enough to be able to say, really strongly one way or the other. But in a lot of ways, it makes sense. I've written in the past about alternative routes into teaching as a way of getting people who are, highly likely to be good teachers, but don't necessarily want to do 4 years of theory before they can actually teach a subject they know well. So I'm really open to those sorts of ideas, but I can't say much more than that.
Well, I'm a product of a teachers' college and a university, so I'll have to think about that one. So, anyone else there? Justine? Yeah.
I hate to go back to the medical analogy again, but I'm going to. I think possibly that model with the much... I guess the hesitation removing teaching from universities completely is the research component that you can do in universities that Tom talked about too. So I think the postgraduate avenue might be sort of worth exploring in more detail rather than just taking that all together. But also, I think, sort of better integration of practice and theory. And I think that's one of the problems that I see in teacher education, is that it's so divorced from the reality of the classroom. And beginning teachers, there's survey after survey of beginning teachers who say they come to school, they have to chuck out everything they've been taught at university, and the teachers in the classroom say, this is how you do it. And so I think perhaps the medical internship model, where you do more on-the-ground training, and some of the universities are starting to do that now with, and I guess Melbourne Uni is possibly the best example of that.
Okay, Tom?
Your turn.
Yeah, I do want to say, my general instinct is to force them more deeply into universities. That is, to force universities along the point made to share the risk that is being channeled through teacher education faculties because of the nature of the funding dynamic, where people can come in and then they are out, and there's actually a minimum of contingent risk on other faculties. I think universities should be forced to actually share the risk, so that you only get to do a teaching qualification if you've passed and entitled to go to the second year of another degree. I think the links are lacking with teaching practice as much as they're lacking with empiricism and intellectual rigour. They are both. In fact, they're isolated from both. That is my diagnosis of the problem. So you've got to get the teachers in there, and then you've got to get the faculties in with the rest of the university, is my view.
Okay, just over there. You're next.
Okay, I'm just back from the United States this morning, so I'm a bit dopey, but I was having it at a wonderful conference at the International Dyslexia Association. And yes, they've faced the same sorts of things that we've faced, but they've got fabulous, well-researched, well-documented standards for teaching of reading that have come with many, many references. They're now getting them implemented in a lot of the universities in the United States, and we can't improve the standards until we have the professors knowing what a syllable is. Because in their studies, it's not just the poor young people that are coming in with low ATARs. It's the professors that are teaching them that lack the knowledge. And they're addressing that on a systematic basis, and it's a basis that's being grounded in legislation. If you look at there's legislation in Missouri and many other states that are miles ahead of what we've got here. So let's look at what's there overseas. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. I know they speak with another accent, but they do speak English, so all their research is valid here. We don't have to go through any more committees. So there's a lot out there, and I do think that we do need to certainly have it within universities, but make it at a university level. And because there is so much research out there already, that we just have to make it say that we know what, as we say, we know what works. Let's do it.
Jen?
Oh, I'd certainly agree with the argument that there is a lot of research. There's a huge amount of consensus around the evidence, and that applies obviously to children with dyslexia as well. That these strategies that have been shown to work the best for teaching children to read work particularly, they work for all children, but particularly for children with reading difficulties like dyslexia. Right. Yeah, the legislation has been pretty strong in the States, and until now, I think it's the effects of it have appeared to be quite patchy, whereas in the UK there's much more evidence to suggest that it has that the legislation there or the approach there has worked a bit better. The PEARLS data that I showed earlier shows the UK and the US doing pretty well relative to Australia and New Zealand. We're way down the list, and you can see strong differences in the policies, and certainly we haven't gone as far as legislation in Australia. So, we've been really wishy-washy from that point of view compared with those countries.
Anyone else on the panel? No? Yes? Okay, next one down here. We've got a lot of questions, so we'll try and squeeze them all in if we can.
I'm Dimitri Kaplegin. I was one of these
Is that mic on?
migrants who came to Australia 6 years old.
Could you put the mic closer to your mouth, please?
And I only spoke Russian and a bit of German, and I learned to speak English. I can't remember what happened, but I continued speaking Russian at home, and I reached a stage where I could only speak and not read. And when Russians came to Australia, I was quite shocked. I behaved like a dyslexic. Not being able to read is just amazing. The experience was quite an eye-opener for me. But my question today is that you've covered such a wide ground, and but at the university level, there's still not agreement between academics, and that's not clear. So I can't see why pushing people up into academia is going to solve the problem. I think it's got to be more understanding about that. But what about the resistance to intervention? There's a lot of percentages shown today. What sort of percentage do you think there really is of children who have had the correct way of teaching but still drop away? And I've read 5%, I've read 17%, 15%, and the problem is perhaps the definition of resistance to intervention or dyslexia. But I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
That's for Jen or for Tom, perhaps. Jen?
So you're asking me what percentage I think of kids need some sort of reading intervention. At the moment, at least 20%, probably 30%, but that's across the board. So because problems with reading are not evenly distributed across the population, there are more children in particularly socioeconomically disadvantaged schools where the standards of reading are very low. You know, as much as half probably of those children would need some sort of reading intervention. At the moment, the most common type of reading intervention is in Year 1. That's the only formal reading intervention that is available to all schools in New South Wales, public schools that is, and that's reading recovery. And only a certain number of children can participate in reading recovery, and once they're past Year 1, that's it. So if they didn't get reading recovery or if it didn't work for them, then the rest of their schooling will really be a struggle unless somehow or other they get into some sort of other program. So that, again, is part of the problem. So initial reading instruction is not top shelf, and then the large number of kids who then need some sort of help quite often don't get it, or if they miss out, then it's a long road through school for them.
Okay. The lady down the back there with the spotted top. Yeah. Just wait for the mic, thanks.
Hi.
Yeah.
We've been far too trusting. Our academics have let us down in teacher training. I'm absolutely certain that's the place we have to start, and I've had personal experience of it. I've tried to present a research study involving the use of phonic methodology to assist students who have dyslexia and are gifted, so there's no problem with their intellectual capacity. And it took me 12 months to get it through, and you think, okay, there could be a problem with this woman. No, I just had a problem with the ideology in the university. I chose the wrong university. How could it be that I could go to the wrong university? How can there be a wrong university for studying how to teach children reading? We've been trusting, and some people have gained their academic positions in the universities on the basis of their high ability or capacity in visual literacy or in how to do drama or some other expertise within the whole idea of English, and really have no idea at all. Now, I started teaching in 1975, and I wasn't trained well. I was not trained well. I was sent out to teach all the students in the school, in the country school, who had been left and just not learned. So we're looking back an awfully long way before we had high levels of expertise in everybody knowing how to teach reading. I want to know what we can do to change the way academics are given the position and the high level of responsibility to be allowed to be the ones who teach how to teach reading to the students. How can we intervene there?
Who would like to take that up? Tom or Justine, maybe? Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I said everything I knew. I was afraid that I would be tested to go further. Look, I do believe that simply an initial point is to make it a requirement in curriculum to provide the content and the skills that enable teachers to teach reading explicitly and with the range of skills that are said, and to be aware of what context in what ways, and then to assess students. It's a subsequent question as to whether we have enough people in the universities that can do that. That's the point at which I pass to Justine.
Well, I would say, we now...
And we may. I don't know that we don't. I should say that.
Perhaps a start is the now teacher education programs have to be accredited, and if universities say they want to don't judge us on our inputs, judge us on our outputs, if we can have effective evaluation of graduates as they leave, and you don't get to pass unless you actually meet the standards, then that would go some way to enforcing some rigour. But you've got the hard question there. It's the intractable problem.
I've met an awful lot of teachers in my teaching career, and I really have to tell you, you don't last very long if you haven't got a passion for it. There are a lot of people, yes, I know, you've all met teachers who really don't care and they just want to leave at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but the vast majority who last want to do it well. When I do an in-service course and I talk to them about how to teach reading with phonics as a big part of the Big Five, the whole lot, they go, wow, why has nobody ever told me about this before?
Teachers are hungry for it.
They want to know. So on the pre-service and the in-service level, we've let them down. There's no other profession in the world that is meant to know material that they weren't taught. Can you see what I'm saying? Like, we want to blame them. It's too easy.
My question was related to, we've heard a little bit around the importance of oral language in setting kids up for success, and then we've also had a lot of discussion around what perhaps needs to happen to enable teachers to be able to teach reading better. I just wondered around the planning and alignment of those early childhood strategies with then what happens in primary education and then secondary.
Okay, who'd like to take that one?
There might be someone here who knows a bit more about that than I do. Part of my PhD thesis was looking at the connections, particularly between children of low socioeconomic status and their poor literacy levels, and it comes back to, as I said, the oral language that they are exposed to and learn within the home, plus all those things around print. And those children are less likely to go to preschool and be taught those things in that environment before they get onto school. And that is becoming, it's clearer and clearer that that preschool year is really, really important, because the gaps that children have when they arrive at school in their literacy ability tend to widen over time unless they get really, really good early literacy instruction in their first year at school. But it's very hard to close them, particularly the vocabulary gap. That's the tough one, because they're as children who already have good language progress through school, they read more, they talk more, so that naturally they make greater gains than the ones who had trouble starting off with in the first place. They plateau, the gap gets wider. As for, are you talking about policy for early education, particularly?
The mind.
That's stereo, yeah.
I guess often early childhood gets separated from the other part of education, and I think we're setting teachers up in some way to fail, or the argument will be that there a proportion of students' potential and capacity for literacy growth is related to what happens in the home. So if that box isn't ticked, then do you know what I mean?
Yes.
You have to, if there's not a concerted effort to address both aspects, what are we setting up our students for, and what are we setting teachers up to make it achievable?
Yeah. Now, the job of teachers in schools is much harder if children haven't had that good home learning environment and haven't been to preschool. But then there are a lot of preschools that don't take that responsibility on board either. They're very much attached to their play-based curriculum, and they don't necessarily, you don't have to abandon, the whole preschool should be fun, play-based ideal in order to introduce fundamental literacy concepts to children in those years before school. It doesn't have to be drilling and all sit in a row and say the alphabet over and over again. There are ways to do that to set children up to be successful at school.
I'd say it goes back even further. Sorry to jump in. So the neurological research shows it's the first 3 years of life that is really crucial in forming those neural pathways. And really we need to think about education not starting at 5 or 6 with primary school, but, at 0 essentially. Because by the time they start school, if they're behind the 8 ball, it's almost impossible for them to catch up, and we are setting our teachers an impossible task. But part of the problem with that is parents are actually part of the problem in that, because they still see childcare as babysitting, and they're resistant to the idea of early education because they have visions of babies in rows like classrooms. So I think there's an education of the community that needs to happen, because sort of the idea of institutionalising children in daycare, like it's before preschool. I'd say preschool's even too late. You really need to get that 0 to 3-year-old age group is the crucial intervention. I'll just be really quick because I'll tell you a great story. There's a fabulous program called Abecedarian that started in the States. It's been going for 30 or 40 years now, and they've started to, I think Victoria's starting to do in the Territory and places, and the results are amazing because they work with, like in America, sort of black uneducated parents who have a lot of single parent families where the parent hasn't graduated from high school, and it's very cost effective. They just teach the parents games they can play with the kids, but they're early literacy games, and not only do the kids catch up, but the IQs actually lift. I'd always thought of IQ as a set thing, but they actually showed that the kids with the intervention, the IQ raised significantly, and the kids where there was no intervention, the IQ actually dropped.
Tom, yeah.
I just wanted to say, I'll relate this back to your point. One of the great things about Jennifer's enunciation of the issue has been the careful qualification of what she says. So, it doesn't apply in all circumstances, in all places. And one of the problems with the effective teaching discussion is that it tends to elicit people saying, this is good teaching or that's good teaching for all things in all places. And there's a lack of regard of the different purposes of education for different year levels, and then in high school for different learning areas. So for instance, you'll hear teachers very often say that all learning is very cyclical. You keep coming back. Well, if you're a maths teacher, it's relatively hierarchical. And so maths teachers go to the staff meetings and they just sort of sit up the back and go back and then ignore it. And then they get accused of being blockers and recalcitrants, Well, in fact, the dogma doesn't accord with what they know. One of the dimensions of that is schools dismissing early childhood teachers as being without substance and play base, and early years teachers dismissing schools as being not about the child but about the curriculum. What we have to recognise is the differences and have a discussion that's much more sophisticated and recognises the different purposes, related purposes at different times. And one of the things we have to do is make time for kindergarten and year 1 teachers, particularly in low socioeconomic communities, to actually do this work. They currently have a curriculum for which I'm responsible. That means they have to cover 8 key learning areas and cover certain outcomes. The good ones ignore me and get the literacy done and the numeracy.
Okay, the lady in green over here. The lady in green now, and then I think maybe 2 after that. So you and then the lady in the stripe, then the gentleman down the front.
I just want to touch on the gentleman who talked about leadership. I'm a year 1 teacher in a public school, and have been in that school for probably 7 years. I just think probably I shouldn't have the camera on me. I don't want to lose my job.
Well, no, it's got me.
But I have a background in teaching children with learning difficulties to read, and I have my own 2 sons had severe difficulties, and I taught them because I got so fed up with the school. I gave up my job and got myself trained and taught them. Went on to teach many children, and then I went to Macquarie University and did a 2-year teaching degree, well, postgrad. And then I got this job in a public school, and I went in with so much passion for teaching children with reading difficulties. I knew exactly what to do. I wrote wonderful programs for them. And I must say I have been completely disheartened over the years because I have had so little time in the classroom to actually deal with those children because of all the other expectations that I have to put up with in my school, which are all very valuable, I'm sure, but they detract from teaching the nitty-gritty of reaching these little ones. For example, last week at my school, it was a wonderful week for the children and they had a lot of fun, but a large part of the time they were out of the classroom going to music shows, we were gardening, we had a delegation from China coming to watch us sing in choirs, we had maple dancing, so many things that I don't think I got to do my reading groups. I'm a year 1 teacher, don't forget. I think I got to do my reading groups once in that entire week. Now, the little ones that are particularly of concern, I think I only got to hear them read once that whole week, and I'm supposed to hear them read every day. And so you can imagine my despair at the end of the day when I think about all the things I'm supposed to be doing. And my question is this thing about leadership, which you touched on. My leaders, I'm on to our 3rd principle, and in the 7 years I've been there, I think only one of them has ever come in to see how I teach reading and take part in a reading group. And I don't know whether I'm just, one little teacher in one little school, and I'm sure there are many, I know my colleagues, we all feel the same frustration. We just sort of soldier on. And not only that, we have, because of our inclusive policy, we have to take on all children, and a lot of the time we have to deal with children with extreme behaviour problems and receiving little support. So a lot of your day might be dealing with children not really sitting still in your classroom or disrupting your lessons, and leaders don't seem to take that on board. I find I don't get a lot of support. It's just about ticking those boxes, and all looks good. And if you look at our newsletter, everything looks good. But scratch the surface, I'm puzzled.
Okay, we'll just move on then. Tommy, you want to comment? Yes.
Yeah, it goes back to the accountability question. It's at this moment that I wish the video weren't on, but I'll forge ahead anyway. The politics of education, I'm not referring to this current government or any government in recent times. The politics of education is that the focus will be on the teachers. But in fact, we know that the most direct influence on what teachers do are their principals. That's a much more sensitive political domain to deal with. But if you want to get to the teachers, you should get to the principals. And yet there's very little emphasis. There has been historically very little emphasis on the accountability and the role or responsibilities of principals.
Jen, do you look as though you want to say something?
Yeah, only to agree that I think anyone who's ever spent any time in a school knows how important the principal is to the way that whole school functions, and their priorities often determine the priorities of everyone else. So I certainly I hear what you say. I don't think that your situation is necessarily typical. I don't know about that, but I'm sure it's quite common that teachers are trying to deal with a very crowded day.
We need to move on. We need to move on. So the lady here and then the gentleman in the front, and then we'll have to finish up. So if you could be quick, that'd be appreciated.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed everything this evening. Tom, I was really impressed with how confidently you gave your last sentence. Do you remember what you said for your last sentence?
Yes, I do. And look, teachers are hungry for substance.
I agree. But I'm concerned because we're getting into the new syllabus. And the new syllabus does not reflect the demise of the constructive approach, I don't think. The new syllabus, if you look up a word like reflect, you get nearly 200 sightings of the word. Right. If you look up phonics, you get 3. If you look up, do you know, that's a big difference. And teachers are very hungry, and teachers are more than just, they really want to do the right thing, and they will work so hard to give phonics only this much time and reflection that much, because that's what their syllabus tells them.
Yes, I brought with me a brief that was prepared by my people to the Minister in response to articles in the Oz highlighting all the areas where we mentioned phonics and phonemics and so on defensively. I refer back to the beginning where I say I don't absolve myself of responsibility. Of course, I don't. Frankly, I wouldn't have read it until final stages. There are sort of this myriad of processes. I'm going to get Phil into it. Phil's at the back. Phil's partly responsible, more responsible, I'd put to Phil. For a car, there are. It's a cultural issue. It would require. I don't want to sound defensive at all. I don't want to be. I want to agree with you, but to say it would require me taking on not just all the consultative groups, but in fact the ultimate bedrock in universities. That's the issue.
Yes.
Okay, quickly, a gentleman here. A very quick one, and then
for a very quick answer. How many years do you believe it will be before phonics and the other 5 big ideas are adopted, have a widespread adoption in New South Wales?
Well,
it could happen relatively quickly if all teachers were given, professional development.
I guess my question is, realistically, being practical, bureaucratic, all that, how long will it be before I should invest in phonics?
I can't say realistically how long it could be. I can tell you my estimate of ideally, potentially how quick it could be, within a year.
All it takes is a catalyst. This article could be it, right. and work such as that happens in Stevens University could be, spread. The great work that happens there could happen, in a moment. It's just a historical circumstance.
Okay, well, I'll give Stephen then the last word. Do you want to come here, Stephen, please? Stephen is a senior fellow at CIS and the immediate past Vice-Chancellor of Macquarie University.
Thanks. Vice-Chancellor of 3 universities, and I still haven't figured it out, Look, thank you very much for that. All this very articulate and obviously very knowledgeable speakers, and I think everybody here is stimulated, but in a way profoundly depressing, because can I go back to the very beginning? There's Jennifer. Rudolf Flesch wrote the book Why Johnny Can't Read in 1955, as you saw on the slide, and identified it as a lack of phonics teaching. And at the time there was this see and say teaching routine. And he actually had a phonics curriculum in the back of the book that you could use at home or you could use at school. It wasn't as developed as many are today after many years of research, but he had his heart in the right place and it would have worked. That was in 1955. Jennifer didn't mention that in 1983, almost 30 years later, Rudolf Flesch wrote a book called Why Johnny Still Can't Read. And this was a little bit different. This was an analysis of progressivism, constructivism, and the damage that it was doing, and the politics of it all. As Thomas Mann said, everything is politics. And it turns out even reading is politics. And that was in 1983. Now, we're 30 years after that, and we're having the same discussion still. So we're now on 60 years of saying essentially the same criticism, offering exactly the same advice, and yet nothing much has changed. And we still have exactly the situation we had before. And you have to ask yourself, and there are politicians here, who benefits? So you always have to ask yourself, when something won't change for 60 years, it must be in somebody's interests to keep it this way. It's not obvious to me who, and it's not obvious to me why. But until we come to that, I think we'll be here 30 years from now and having the same discussion again, and maybe 1,000 years from now. There needs to be a circuit breaker here, and we need to understand why it is that these ideas persist. And I was quite taken to hear that the new curriculum gives a very short shrift to phonics, and the same old tried and true, the same old claptrap, the same old, what was it? Postmodernist claptrap keeps going. And I don't think, Justine, despite feeling good about it, because I used to be the Dean of Medicine, that medicine's going to provide you with much of an example. We have a journal called Evidence-Based Medicine. Did you know that? Which suggests that the rest of it... So whether we're to the savior of this is another matter. And then we have Tom's prescriptions, which sound good, But another degree on top of a worthless degree already, we'll have a second worthless degree, is not really a solution to anything, Tom, is it? It's just another thing to add on without changing anything at all. So I don't know the answer to any of this, except to say that I've been very stimulated by what I've heard. But can I add one thing that I think everybody here already knows, that the victims of all this are the poorest people in Australia. They're the most victimised people in Australia. Your kids are going to learn to read, I promise you. My kids learn to read, my grandchildren learn to read. They're not the problem. The problem are all those people who are in the worst situation already. They've been victimised by their circumstances, and now they're being victimised again by their schools. And it's a tragedy for everyone. So let's hope somebody listens and there is a change sometime. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I'm a perpetual optimist, so I think, maybe it won't be 30 more years, but wherever it is, and maybe like Jennifer, it's only one. But I think what we've heard tonight is a fantastic sort of explanation of the problems and some ways out of it. And I appreciate not only our three speakers, but everyone else's participation. But would you please join me and thank our speakers? Thank you, everybody. Good evening.